Hey guys, it's Mike here, and in this video, I'm going to be reviewing Terminator Dark Fate, the newest retcon sequel to Terminator 2, that ignores all of the other sequels while simultaneously ripping them off whenever it gets the chance. But this time, it's for real. James Cameron said so. Well, at least until the next reboot, where he'll say the same thing, and then backtrack on it immediately afterward. Now, ever since I was a kid, I loved the Terminator movies, particularly the first two. I still remember the first time I saw Terminator 2 as a young child, when I put a VHS into my VCR expecting it to be one of my favorite Godzilla movies, only for it to have been taped over, something that really annoyed me. But my annoyance quickly turned to awe as the amazing action thrill ride began and captured my imagination. It was perhaps the first film to introduce me to Arnold Schwarzenegger, perhaps the greatest blockbuster movie star of all time who made so many classics. And even at his worst, his movies were far more enjoyable than most of the CGI-filled logic-bereft movies of today like Skyscraper, that get sharded out all the time. So with these films being close to my heart, I went back and marathoned the entire series before seeing Dark Fate, which I think gave me some real insight into the problems with this franchise, as I experienced all of the highs and all of the lows. The first two Terminator movies are masterpieces of action and cinema in general, telling the story of a desperate future where machines run by the AI Skynet have conquered the world and are trying to wipe out humanity. However, under the leadership of one man, John Connor, the Resistance was able to defeat Skynet. However, not before they utilized their ultimate weapon, a time machine, in an attempt to kill John Connor before he was even born. In T1, they sent a Terminator back to kill his mother, Sarah Connor. And then in T2, they sent one back to kill John himself as a boy. The stakes are perfectly established, and James Cameron's writing and direction were excellent in both films. Whereas Terminator 1 was a darker, tension-filled movie with more horror elements, as this killer from the future stalked Sarah and Kyle Reese, Terminator 2 totally flipped on its head by having that very same killing machine protect her and her son. The action scenes and effects in 1 were impressive, but 2 took everything to the next level, giving us even bigger chase sequences and more of them, as well as a far more powerful threat in the T-1000, played excellently by Robert Patrick. And while it was a little more lighthearted, injecting comedy and the dynamic between John and the T-800, there is still a great amount of tension throughout. These two films have stood the test of time as classics. However, I can't say the same for the rest of the movies, as they largely devolve from here. Terminator 3 took a step down in every regard, becoming essentially a farce and a spoof of Terminator movies, with ridiculous comedy and poor performances throughout, such as by the TX played by Christina Loken, a female Terminator who feels like she was written by a 13-year-old boy. Linda Hamilton didn't return as Sarah Connor, so she was killed off screen. And Nick Stahl as John Connor was utterly miscast. This movie holds up even worse after watching the first two, and so did the rest. Now, Salvation at least tried new things, finally going to the future where John Connor is a member of the Resistance. However, it wanted to show audiences how he became that leader in the first place, which in retrospect was kind of a mistake. Christian Bale is a great actor, so he was great casting when it came to John Connor, and he gave a good performance, well, at least when he wasn't doing his Batman voice or yelling at the lighting technician. However, he's not even the real main character here, because Marcus, a human-machine hybrid played by Sam Worthington, takes up a large percentage of the film, and a lot of his scenes are boring, and they slow down the pacing of the film to a crawl. It also has a real lack of Arnold, who is the governor of California at the time. But despite that, I'd say that this was overall a solid movie, and probably the best Terminator 3 out of the bunch, not counting T2 Battle Across Time. But it quickly went downhill once again with Terminator Genisys, a glorified rehash and reboot of all previous movies, which made the writing of T3 look like it was written by George R.R. Martin. Well, at least his books anyway, as opposed to the other thing Emilia Clarke was in. The plot of this movie makes little to no sense, the time travel especially. The action here is also way too ridiculous at times, and practically everyone is miscast in the roles, with Jai Courtney as Kyle Reese being the biggest example. Just comparing Michael Biehn's amazing performance to what Jai Courtney did in this movie is night and day, and they don't even seem like the same character at all. Now, Emilia Clarke looks a lot like Linda Hamilton, but with her stature and build, she's totally unbelievable as the badass that we met in T2, or even the version here who'd actually been training for even longer. However, just like in the other movies, Arnold is a lot of fun here, with him and J.K. Simmons doing their best to make the movie entertaining despite the dumpster fire of a script. So with that all being said, my expectations for Terminator 3 Dark Fate, this time it's for real, weren't very high, especially considering the politically charged marketing campaign for the film. And now upon seeing the movie, it largely lived up to my low expectations. So the plot of Terminator Dark Fate is pretty much the same as the first two movies, but with some slight tweaks here and there. Danny Reyes is a young girl living in the present time in Mexico working at a car factory, when suddenly a robot from the future called the Rev 9 shows up and tries to kill her. However, a protector from the future, Grace, who's been augmented with machine parts, shows up to try and help her escape. Apparently, Danny is the future savior of mankind after the timeline was changed in T2. But this time, the enemy isn't Skynet, but rather a new evil AI called Legion. What an original name. However, their Terminator is just too tough to beat, so Sarah Connor arrives to help protect them as well. And after running for some time, finally, the T-800 joins their group, and they form an alliance of needs to protect and train Danny before making their final stand against the Rev 9. Oh, and there's a lot of action and explosions too. Honestly, I was kinda dreading this movie, and I thought I was going to hate it based upon what I'd seen and heard going in. But I actually didn't. It's not exactly a good movie, but it isn't this abomination some people are making it out to be either. So let me start by talking about some of the positives here. But don't worry, it's not going to be a long list. Now, the first thing that I have to praise about this movie would be the thing that got me into the theater in the first place. And that is the return of Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor and Arnold Schwarzenegger as the T-800. Linda Hamilton has always been great in this role, and that definitely carries over into this movie as well. This time, she's even older and more grizzled than she was in the previous movie. And her character is actually handled very similarly to how Laurie Strode's character was handled in Halloween 2018. Which is funny because when that movie came out, many people, including myself, mentioned how they basically had turned Laurie Strode into Sarah Connor, where she had spent decades training in order to one day fight off this killer. However, in this case, Sarah Connor isn't just fighting one, but many, as she goes around killing other Terminators, hunting them down and ensuring that they don't kill anyone else. Due to certain things that happened before the story of this film took place, she's a lot more jaded and cynical than she was even in Terminator 2. And she serves largely a Kyle Reese type of role here, trying to protect Danny Reyes so that she doesn't die and doom the entire world in the process. And of course, Arnold is really great too, once again returning, as it was shown in the trailers, as another Terminator who is helping out and protecting the future savior of mankind. And every time Arnold returns to this role, due to his growing age, people are always concerned about how he's going to pull it off, and if it's going to be believable. But they pretty much do what they did with Terminator Genisys here, and explain that the biological components of the Terminator age over time. Which of course makes sense considering the fact that if a Terminator is sent on a many-year-long infiltration mission, it would only make sense for him to grow older, or else people would instantly know that he's not a real person. And on the topic of being a real person, this film really goes deep into just what would happen if a rogue Terminator was living among humanity and civilization for decades. Just how much he would learn, and just how much like a human being he would become. And this is definitely the most human T-800 that we've seen so far. And I could see for certain people maybe that would be a con, because oftentimes Arnold doesn't really even feel like a true Terminator here just as he did in the first two films. However, based upon just how much the Terminator learned in Terminator 2 during his short time with John Connor, I think it only makes sense that multiplying that over the course of decades would yield a similar result. And Arnold goes right back into that performance just as he always does, delivering some really funny deadpan humor, and doing well in the action scenes. And while the film isn't really that engaging for a large portion of its runtime, when he enters the fray, it becomes a lot more entertaining. And a lot of that also comes down to his dynamic with Linda Hamilton as Sarah Connor, with her hating him due to certain things that happened before the story really began, as well as her not trusting him due to the fact that he is in fact an infiltration unit and in her eyes could be a threat. But the dynamic between the two is really good, and perhaps the best part of the movie, even though their inclusion in this film doesn't necessarily feel organic and is largely nostalgia bait which serves to prop up the new and less interesting characters that we get introduced to, as well as putting some butts in the seats, which seems a little contradictory considering the overall message of the film. And speaking of new characters, I also think that Mackenzie Ryan did a pretty good job as Grace, the Protector from the new alternate future who was sent back in time to protect Danny Reyes. She's shown in other movies like Blade Runner 2049 that she's a good actress, and I think that she does fine for the most part with what she's given here, although what's given here is pretty hard to work with for any actor. And as I referenced before, there are some fun action sequences that happen during the course of this movie, and some fun moments. Although, as I'm about to get into, not everything works particularly well within the grand scheme of the franchise. Now, my first major con with this movie actually takes place in the very first scene of the film. And without explaining exactly what happens during it, it's a scene that could very easily break this film for longtime fans of the franchise. And despite the fact that I already knew about it going in, it's still something that I don't like. And I think the decision made here by Tim Miller and the writers regarding a classic and central character to the franchise and how they dealt with it was completely misguided and unnecessary. I understand that they're trying to establish these new characters, but in order to facilitate that, they basically went the route of Alien 3, and as we've seen with movies like The Last Jedi, handling the legacy characters like this, especially in such a long-running franchise that is built off of the earlier films, just isn't the right way to go. And I could see a lot of fans not being able to get past that first 5 minutes, which could very easily bring down the rest of the film for you. That's hardly the only problem this movie has. Beyond that, my biggest problem with the movie would definitely have to come down to the writing. Because unfortunately, it seems like the people working on this film behind the scenes just didn't learn enough from the other films that took place after Terminator 2. And in some ways, this film is actually the worst written of the entire franchise. The dialogue, for instance, is really bad, with so many poorly written lines that these actors have to say, either when it comes to one-liners or exposition, that it hurts every scene it happens in. And speaking of scenes just happening, there are so many coincidences in this film, and events that just take place because the screenwriter just dictated it happens. So many things just happen that audiences and the characters are just expected to immediately accept as they move on to the next big set piece. And when it comes to the final climactic fight of the movie, it basically just happens with no real build-up because it's time to have the final fight. Comparing that to the final battle of Terminator 1 or 2, for instance, shows you just how poorly handled this one was. Which no doubt, at least in part, comes down to the fact that there is like 4+ writers just working on this one screenplay alone. And normally when you see a film that has that many screenwriters working on it, you know that you're in for a mess. Although there were some interesting elements that maybe if they were handled better could have made this film better as a result, but unfortunately the direction here from Tim Miller is also really poor. I'm not entirely sure why that is, considering I thought that he did a really good job with the original Deadpool movie, but taking a look at this film, it seems like a lot of that might have just come from Ryan Reynolds. Because his direction here, for the most part, is honestly pretty weak, especially when it comes to the dialogue scenes, which again isn't helped by the fact that the actors are having to read such poor dialogue, but it seems like every scene where the characters have to deliver dialogue or exposition is completely rushed, and shot in a way where it just feels like Tim Miller has no idea how to direct a dialogue scene. So much of what made the first two movies great is how James Cameron directed the actors and got great performances out of them, and also framed the scenes and shot them in such a unique and interesting way, to where everything looked great and had that signature James Cameron lighting and style. But in this film, everything is just muddy and poorly shot, where a lot of scenes I feel like could have been way better if they were just shot competently. or even if they were edited competently, because there's a lot of really strange cuts in this movie that I noticed, and I'm not sure if they exist for the sake of pacing, like cutting out scenes that went on way too long, or if it was done for content, because there's a couple shots in this movie where it seems like something violent is supposed to be happening, and the film cuts away, which is strange considering the fact that it's rated R. Although considering some of what James Cameron has said in recent weeks about how he, the editor, and Tim Miller were kind of arguing over the final cut of the film while the film was being edited, I feel like that definitely reflects on the finished product. And another problem, which comes down to post-production, would have to be the CGI. Because there's way too much CG in this film, and most of it isn't very good. Especially when it comes to the Rev 9, played by Gabriel Luna. And I honestly don't think he did a bad job with the role. You know, based on the trailers, I thought he was going to be pretty weak and generic, but I thought he did fine with what he was given, especially when he was interacting with other people and going about his infiltration mission, kind of channeling Robert Patrick's performance in T-1000. And I thought that the endoskeleton had a pretty cool design. However, when it came down to his liquid metal components, I didn't think the CGI for them was very good. And somehow, despite the fact that Terminator 2 came out almost 30 years ago, the liquid metal effects that they had in that movie look way better than they did in this one. Maybe it's because this one used it way too much, considering the fact that the Terminator was constantly separating, and due to the constant explosions and over-the-top action in this movie, his liquid metal was constantly being blown apart and having to reform. The fact is, it just didn't really hold up, and what you see in the trailer is pretty much what you see in the movie. And that goes for most of the CG, because you can almost always tell what you're seeing is CGI. However, I would say that there actually is one great example of CG in this movie, which comes down to the de-aging effect. Because there are some flashbacks to Linda Hamilton when she was younger, and the de-aging effect on her looks great. Up there with what we've seen in movies like Ant-Man the Wasp and Captain Marvel. And we even get to see another de-aged Arnold who looks really good too. Now there isn't a lot of motion during these scenes, and you could tell at certain points that there is an effect there, but if you were to look at this, you would have thought that they shot these scenes back in 1991 around the time that the first movie came out. But when it comes to the action sequences, they just utilize so much CGI, and on top of that, some of what we're seeing is just so unrealistic, especially when it comes to the final act of the film. During one of the final action sequences involving a military plane and a dam, that's just so unbelievable, I don't even understand how they approved it for the movie. Maybe it would have made sense in a Deadpool movie, but not here, where the characters don't have regeneration. But really, another big problem is the fact that this film is just so derivative. There's nothing really new or original. In many ways, it's like Terminator Genesis, where it's basically rehashing the first two movies and taking elements from all the other ones. The plot is just basically Terminator 1 and 2. The villain is basically a kind of upgraded version of the TX from Terminator 3, complete with a liquid metal over the endoskeleton. Grace is a combination of Kyle Reese with Marcus from Terminator Salvation, and we've already seen an older Terminator helping out the protagonist in Terminator Genesis. And all of this is in the service of propping up these new characters who simply don't live up to the original ones from the first two movies, which is another big problem with the film because Natalia Reyes is really miscast as this character Danny, and just not really believable as this future savior of mankind. Her performance isn't on the level of Linda Hamilton in T1 or 2. Her character is way too easily accepting of future elements, especially considering when we compare it to how Sarah Connor took a lot longer to accept everything that Kyle Reese told her in Terminator 1, at first completely denying everything and trying to see if maybe he was crazy. Whereas in this movie, she just instantly accepts it and goes along on this journey. And the journey that her character goes on echoes Sarah Connor's journey from Terminator 1 and 2, mixed with John Connor. However, it's completely rushed and not done as well, which is one of the major problems when it comes to combining two films worth of character development into one. Just look at the transformation that Linda Hamilton went through from Terminator 1 to Terminator 2. Danny doesn't do any of that in this movie. And when we flash forward to seeing her in the future, much like how we saw John Connor in the future as the leader of mankind, once again, she's just totally unbelievable. She's even less believable here than Emilia Clarke in Terminator Genesis. And she simply doesn't compare to the mythical John Connor or the mother who trained him. And the same could be said for Grace, who doesn't compare in any way to Michael Biehn or his great performance. Just in that one movie, you not only get to know him way better than you know Grace, but you have a far greater personal attachment to him, especially due to his relationship with Sarah Connor, and they come together through romance to give birth to the future savior. With Kyle Reese being sent back by his own son, without even knowing this information, in order for his son to be conceived and him to die in the process. But the connection between Danny and Grace isn't anywhere near as strong as that, and neither of them is developed particularly well, with Grace almost seeming redundant considering the fact that Sarah Connor is there, which kind of diminishes both of their roles because they're basically serving the same purpose, and honestly they should have just combined them into one character. But of course they wanted Linda Hamilton to come back for nostalgic purposes, and they wanted to try and prop up their new strong female characters who are replacing the old male ones. And how much the new characters lack compared to the old only stands out even more when the old characters are right there alongside them. And all of it's really symbolic of what we've been seeing in Hollywood in recent years, with movies like the Ghostbusters reboot and The Force Awakens using these older legacy characters to try and build up these new characters so that they can take over the franchise, often with that new lead being a female character. But all too rarely do these writers actually do this in a competent way, and develop the new cast of characters into anything other than a generic one-size-fits-all cookie-cutter character that's meant to appeal to everyone, and in the process doesn't appeal to anyone. With this new character Danny essentially being Ray, a pretty much flawless new main character who doesn't have anywhere near the depth of the original characters, and doesn't seem as believable when it comes to a combat setting, somehow rising up to be the savior of all of mankind. Much like the First Order basically replacing the Empire in nothing but name alone, Legion replaces Skynet, but they still use Terminators and everything is still basically the same. And while it makes sense that humankind would eventually create AI that would overrun them and possibly exterminate them, and this isn't exactly a new story, they could have easily handled it way different than they did. Instead of basically just repeating the same formula of the post-apocalyptic future and this one savior of humanity who's supposed to lead the resistance to victory against the machines. And now I think it would make sense for me to address the elephant in the room, which of course is the politics surrounding this film. Much has been made about the female-centric politics and feminism surrounding this movie, but honestly when it comes to the film itself, there isn't really much of that to be found. Sure, there is some female empowerment subtext during the movie, since most of the cast is female characters, and the film does start out in Mexico, and there are sequences in which characters are crossing the border from Mexico into America, and there are a couple lines here and there, particularly in regards to Danny's importance as a female leader of the future, but most of this served more as a setting and stuff in the background, as opposed to some kind of beat you over the head overt politics. So honestly, at the end of the day, this was all really more of a marketing campaign, launched by Tim Miller and other people working behind the scenes, in order to rile people up and create a kind of counterculture appeal. Kind of like what happened with Captain Marvel, where the media ran wild with the whole political angle. However, this film is far less overt about its politics than Captain Marvel was. So it seems like it was more of a targeted campaign, where they were trying to take advantage of woke culture and all of the outcry that erupted from films like The Last Jedi and Ghostbusters, and try and get tons of people talking about it. Which, as we could see all throughout YouTube, they definitely accomplished that goal. Especially with Tim Miller making remarks about people who might be misogynistic or threatened by strong female characters if they didn't like this movie, which is pretty crazy considering the fact that real Terminator fans loved Linda Hamilton in Terminator 1 and 2, especially when she becomes a badass. And most of these people probably also love characters like Black Widow and Scarlet Witch in the Marvel movies. However, despite the fact that it got a lot of people talking, as we can see now from the opening weekend box office, it didn't end up paying off financially, as the opening was barely above the one from Terminator Genesis. And that isn't even without adjusting for inflation. So maybe the expression that's going around all over the internet these days of go woke and go broke might actually apply to this movie. However, I think most of it comes down to the fact that they realized that this wasn't a great movie when they were making it, so they decided to try and play up the political angle as a last-ditch effort to get anyone interested in the movie at all. But ultimately, in my estimation, people didn't go to this movie because it didn't look like a good movie. And upon actually seeing the movie, that sentiment ended up being correct. And despite the fact that the franchise creator James Cameron was singing the praises of this movie before it came out, he's done that for every other Terminator movie as well. So unfortunately, he doesn't have any credibility left over. And maybe if he actually took time away from all these Avatar sequels that nobody wanted, he might have been able to actually direct this movie and make a good continuation. But as it's been shown time and time again, that's simply never going to happen. And considering how every sequel to Terminator 2 has simply not even come anywhere near as close to their level of quality, I don't think it even should happen. Aside from sending a Terminator way back in the past, so like the 1800s or something, in the Old West days like Back to the Future 3, or finally doing a movie about the real future war that we saw in Terminator 1 and 2, there isn't anywhere else they can really go. And as we saw from this movie, all the people who are running this franchise know what to do is rehash previous movies because they have no creativity or originality whatsoever. I've seen fan fictions that are better than all of the sequels to Terminator 2. And yet somehow these big budget $200 million sequels somehow still end up being worse than fan fiction you can read on the internet for free. So should the franchise end? While it would be nice to see those suggestions I made, ultimately I don't think that the franchise is ever going to reach the levels of Terminator 1 or 2 again, and I don't think anyone in charge of it right now is actually talented enough to do that even if they tried. Now I don't think this is necessarily the worst Terminator, as I could see myself ranking it above Genesis and Terminator 3. However, I still don't think it's quite as good as Salvation, and I don't think it's a movie that you really need to rush out and see in theaters. Maybe if you could see it really cheap during a matinee, or perhaps on Blu-ray or streaming if you're bored one day, but ultimately it's just another example of a movie that doesn't live up to the original 2. So Terminator 6 is in fact a dark fate for the franchise. And I can't help but wonder if somewhere out there is an alternate timeline with a better third entry into this franchise that fans actually love. But I think the problems with this franchise ultimately come down to the fact that it shouldn't have continued after 2. Although the ending of 2 is left open, much like the Star Wars original trilogy, it never needed to be continued. And none of what's come out since has held a candle to it. If it was going to be continued, James Cameron should have just directed the thing and got it over with. But I guess Blue Cats and Outer Space are more important. Well, I sure hope those sequels are worth it, because if they bomb at the box office and are reviled by fans, then the legacy of James Cameron may truly be the darkest fate of all. Make sure to subscribe to this channel and enable notifications so you can see all of my content right away when it comes out.
Yeah, and you better subscribe.